The animosity between Marius and Sulla had slowly grown over the years, and as the 90s BC progressed, that rift continued to widen as various pieces were moved into place, leading up to Rome's first civil war. Sulla had kept his head down while Saturninus rocked the political stage in Rome, but as the waters began to calm in 99, he made his return by running for the office of praetor. Much to his surprise, he lost the election, primarily because the people were not happy with Sulla trying to advance to the praetorship without first getting elected as aedile. The people wanted Sulla to throw some magnificent games as aedile, so as a compromise, he promised that he would throw the games if he were elected praetor next year. He was duly elected for 98 and threw the promised games. Sulla did not disappoint. After an uneventful term as praetor, Sulla was assigned to the province of Cilicia in the east, with the stated aim of clamping down on the rampant piracy in the region. He also worked to end the war between King Nicomedes III of Bithynia and Mithridates VI of Pontus over the kingdom of Cappadocia. Neither king wished to antagonize Rome, so they both agreed to peace, and Sulla installed the pro-Roman Ariobarzanes as ruler of Cappadocia. Next, he sorted out some border issues with the Armenians, and in what became the first diplomatic conference between Rome and Parthia, the chairs were arranged so that Sulla faced the Cappadocian and Parthian diplomats, insinuating that Parthia was not the equal of Rome, but of Cappadocia. After the Parthian Shah learned that his ambassador took this seat, he had the unlucky man executed. That aside, Sulla performed his duties in the east excellently. In 91, King Bocchus of Mauritania embarked on a state visit to Rome, bringing exotic animals, fancy wealth, and, more controversially, a few paintings. Ever since their joint capture of Jugurtha in 107, Sulla and Bocchus had been on friendly terms, and one of the paintings brought over to Rome showed Sulla and Bocchus capturing Jugurtha together. On the surface, it embodied the friendship between Rome and Mauritania, but to Marius it was an insult. According to him, he had defeated Jugurtha and ended the war, and while this was partially true, this painting was an unfriendly reminder of Sulla's key involvement in winning the war for Rome. Marius demanded that the paintings be removed, and when he was denied this request, he vandalized the paintings with some of his friends. The outbreak of civil war between the two men then and there was only halted by the rebellion of half of Italy. The social war had begun. I already have a video on the social war, so I won't go into much detail on that here, but for the 4 years that the war dragged on, Sulla and Marius had two very different experiences. Sulla, on one hand, led a series of very successful campaigns against the Italians, crushing their armies, increasing his prestige in Rome, and earning him the loyalty of several legions. By the war's end, Sulla was one of the brightest stars in Rome. The same could not be said for Marius. He was initially drafted to serve as legate for his nephew Lupus, but the young man was arrogant as all young Romans were, and ignored Marius before getting himself killed. This left Marius to pick up the pieces, and in short order he had restored the efficiency of his army and had the Italians on the run. But before he could achieve anything meaningful, he was replaced as commander by his enemies in the Senate with Quintus Caepio, the son of the Caepio who had caused the massacre at Arausio. Stupidity and arrogance seemed to run in the family, for the younger Caepio ignored Marius and was soon led into a trap and assassinated. Once again, Marius took up the mantle and soon enough won a victory in late 90. Even so, the Senate did not want Marius near an army, and replaced him once again, this time by Lucius Porcius Cato, and in a painfully predictable string of events, Cato ignored Marius's advice, forced him to resign as legate, and soon after got his army slaughtered in a headstrong attack. For Marius, the social war was 4 years of being ignored by his juniors, snubbed by the Senate, and overall disappointment. It must have been a very grating experience for the old man, especially as Sulla began to eclipse him in every regard, and fed into his rapidly returning ambition to win more glory and respect for himself. As the war progressed, the balance of power gradually swung Rome's way, as they wrested back control of the peninsula from the Italians. The social war was all but over by 88, but already Rome was being rocked by conflict abroad. In Asia Minor, Rome became embroiled with the ambitious Mithridates VI of Pontus, in the First Mithridatic War. I plan on doing a dedicated video on that topic as well, so for now all we need to know is that another front opened up with rich pickings for any Roman general. It would be on this issue that Sulla and Marius finally waged civil war. Marius burned to get back in the saddle. In 89, he tried to prove his vigour by doing exercises on the Campus Martius in Rome, but no one was convinced. By then, Marius was 68 years old, and the Romans did not need old men to fight their wars. The fact that he kept being removed from command against the Italians was proof enough that the Senate didn't want Marius near an army, so there was no chance of him getting the job. Marius continued doing press-ups in the capital nevertheless, and Rome watched with equal parts pity and shame. This all came to a head in the election of 88, where Sulla and his ally Quintus Pompeius Rufus won the election. This came as a surprise to no one, and Sulla further advanced his power by marrying Metella, the widow of the grand old Metellus Scaurus. This marriage was advantageous for Sulla because it gathered the Metelli family at his back and aligned him with the powerful Optimates. Sulla was then given the command against Pontus. But before anyone could get to that, violence soon filled the streets of Rome once again, this time induced by a man called Sulpicius, a tribune of the plebs for 88. He had been a supporter of the Optimates until very recently, when he entered an unofficial alliance with Marius. Sulpicius was an admirer of Saturninus and used many of his tactics, namely mob violence. But this time Sulpicius organised his gangs into professional forces and created what he called the Anti-Senate, a group of 300 equestrians to act as bodyguards. He also supplemented these forces with the mercenary swordsmen he kept on his payroll. Sulpicius's first major legislative step was to grant complete suffrage to the Italians. For although the Italians were granted citizenship, the Romans slyly planned to keep them from overwhelming the Roman Saian government by putting them into the final voting tribes. In what was essentially ancient gerrymandering, it would limit the Italian influence to the bare minimum and ensure Roman dominance. What Sulpicius planned to do was to split the Italians equally between the 31 rural voting tribes, therefore giving them unprecedented sway over the voting, and by extension, it would give Sulpicius vast sway over the Republic as the thousands of grateful Italians flooded in to vote. The Romans themselves were aghast, and riots erupted between Sulpicius's anti-senate and the mobs of Rome. Hearing of the disturbances, Sulla, who had previously been overseeing the siege of Nola, returned to Rome to quell the trouble. Both Sulla and Pompeius Rufus emerged at the rostra in Rome and declared a surprise public holiday, thus grinding all public business to a halt. Sulpicius was not amused. His angry gangs began to draw their weapons and the two consuls were soon forced to retreat. Unfortunately, Pompeius's son was caught by the gangs and killed when he defended his father too rashly. With few safe spaces left, Sulla fled to the last place you would expect. Gaius Marius unexpectedly had two guests for dinner. In what must have been a pretty awkward conversation, Marius advised Sulla that the only way to end the crisis was to back down and end the public holiday. Feeling the heat, Sulla caved to the pressure and withdrew the public holiday. For a consul to withdraw his own decree was a humiliation. It was the last time the two men saw each other not as enemies. Sulla must have been grateful to finally get out of Rome, but as he returned to his legions at Nola, Sulpicius blindsided him. He convened the assembly and forced through a law that said the command against Pontus would be transferred from Sulla to Marius. When the news reached Sulla, his fury was apocalyptic. He climbed to the consul's ship and was granted the Pontic command through his own merit, and now here was Marius ripping that away from him, solely due to his jealousy in his old age. Sulla had every right to be furious, but the effect on his soldiers was twofold. He told them of his mistreatment in Rome, and the news that the command had been stolen from him. Sulla was popular among the rank and file, and the soldiers despaired not only that their leader had been humiliated, but also that they might now miss out on the campaign in the east, and thus all of the vast treasure to be plundered from Pontus's riches. It was the perfect storm, and Marius should not have been surprised that it broke over his head. However, I don't think anyone could have anticipated the lengths Sulla was willing to go to maintain his rights to campaign in the east. Marius probably felt proud of himself as he sent two men to secure control of Sulla's army, but as the unfortunate agents approached Sulla's camp, they were seized and killed by angry soldiers. Next, Sulla convened a council of war and proposed his audacious march on Rome. Almost all of his senior officers refused to partake in it, so the Sullan army's upper command was a skeleton crew. Sulla still held the support of the soldiery regardless, so he broke camp and began a slow crawl to Rome. The civil war had finally begun. Sulla's march was intentionally slow so he could see if Marius would simply bend to the pressure and step down, but Marius was resolute. The march continued. Meanwhile in Rome, Marius and Sulpicius scrambled to seize control of the situation and organise the defence of Rome. Sulla's supporters were assassinated, while Sulpicius browbeat the Senate with his gangs. Pompeius Rufus was fortunate enough to escape the assassins and joined up with Sulla, although a few of Sulla's soldiers defected to Marius for ethical reasons. Some senators tried to find a peaceful solution to the situation, but Sulla rebuffed and mistreated their envoys. A final round of negotiations almost led to a conference between Marius and Sulla, but as the talks came to an end, Sulla heard of the continued violence against the supporters and readied his troops for battle. By this point, Marius had only been able to raise a small force of freed slaves, gladiators and gang members, but wild exaggerations led Sulla to believe that the Marians had a far larger force than they actually did. He wasn't taking any chances. Sulla ordered a legion to assault the Esquiline Gate. The forces finally came face to face in the streets of Rome. The Marians flung roof tiles down at the legionaries, but Sulla brought reinforcements and drove them from the roofs with a storm of flaming arrows. Perhaps Marius could have stalled a single legion, but against 6 it was hopeless. After a failed attempt to rally the people, he, along with his allies, fled the city. The victors then led a full legion across the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome across which no citizen could bear weapons, and finished off the remaining Marians. Sulla was now in complete control of Rome, and faced with the awkward task of convincing the Romans that he had conquered them for their own good. He made a point of publicly punishing soldiers caught looting in an attempt to paint himself as a bringer of peace, and gave a speech to the populace, saying that his animosity was aimed at a few select individuals. He then produced a list of 12 people now branded as enemies of the state, and thus could be killed on sight. Sulla promised that he sought to return peace to the Republic, and began to, at least in his mind, set the Republic to rights. He proclaimed that all potential bills must be put before the Senate before they could be given to the people to vote on, strengthened the Senate by doubling their numbers from 300 to 600, and said that any laws passed since Sulla declared the public holiday were invalid. Sulla kept the Pontic command, and the plans to divide the Italians equally between the Roman voting tribes was abandoned. Once this was done, Sulla tried to show that he was no tyrant by sending his army back to continue the siege of Nola, but the mood was tense. The Senate despaired at Sulla's arrogation of the power to reform the Republic, while Sulla claimed that his actions were simply in defence of the Republic, just like Marius's demolition of Saturninus in 100, but unlike then, Sulla had no authorization from the Senate. But Sulla's legions could be very persuasive, and Rome settled into an uneasy peace. Besides, Sulla was not motivated to march on Rome out of an aspiration for power, like Caesar and Augustus would do 40 years later, as shown by his reforms, which were essentially conservative and reactionary in nature. The Marians, meanwhile, split up and scampered to safety, wherever that was. Some were more successful than others. Sulpicius was almost immediately captured and executed, while Marius made it to one of his estates, and from there he went to Ostia, where he caught a ship bound for North Africa. He hoped to raise support among the communities of his veterans he had settled there after the Jugurthine War. Mother Nature had other ideas though, and his ship was wrecked in a storm near Terracina. Terracina itself was run by one of Sulla's friends, so Marius instead made for the friendlier city of Minturnae, hiding in the forests without food or shelter at night. He tried to uplift his remaining followers by reminding them of a tale from his past. One day, a young Marius stumbled upon a huge nest filled with 7 eagle eggs. Given that eagles only lay 2 eggs, this was a rare find, and a local soothsayer told his family that this meant he would hold the highest command 7 times. Marius had served 6 consulships so far, but any plans Marius could have had for a 7th consulship were dashed when he was spotted by a cavalry patrol mere miles from Minturnae. With seconds to save themselves between life and likely death, the remaining Marians spotted 2 ships at sea, threw themselves into the waters, and swam like mad dogs. Marius' supporters reached one boat and forced the captain to take them away, while the captain of the second boat must have gotten the shock of his life as the 69-year-old Marius clambered onto his boat. Caught between the scouts on the shore and the Marians on the boats, the captain chose to leave with Marius. But his luck soon ran out, as the captain did the troll of the century by briefly docking, telling Marius to get some supplies, and promptly sailing away. Dejected and abandoned, Marius trudged inland and begged a peasant for shelter, who reluctantly agreed, but when another patrol banged on his door, he admitted to harbouring Marius, who promptly tore off his clothes and dove into a nearby swamp. Despite submerging himself to the nostrils, Marius was caught and dragged to the city of Mentone naked and with a rope around his neck. All enemies of the state were supposed to be killed on sight, and what should have been the end for Gaius Marius proved to be a blessing in disguise, as the local magistrates were unable to bring themselves to kill him, and thus sent him packing off into exile. Marius then sailed from Mentone, reunited with his followers, and headed for Africa via Sicily. But, as always seemed to be the case with Marius, nothing seemed to go right. His ship briefly anchored in Eryx, and the local quaestor attacked his men, leading to a vicious brawl in the docks where the Marians were only just victorious, fighting tooth and nail. But finally, after so many trials, they had escaped to Africa. The governor, however, forbade Marius for setting foot on the mainland, so Marius brooded on the island of Cercina, just off the African coast. For now, Sulla was triumphant, but his troubles were far from over. While the Romans had squabbled in the west, Mithridates drove hard into the province of Asia, and soon had totally overrun the region. Now he was threatening the provinces of Greece and Macedonia, and if Sulla did not act soon, the entire east could fall. He would have to leave the Marians for now and allow the civil war to fizzle on in the background, but Mithridates had forced his hand. Sulla was going east.